Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar hosted by the Institute of Navigation, featuring the winning team of the 2023 ION Autonomous Snowplow Competition from Case Western Reserve University, Team OTTO. The 13th Annual Autonomous Snowplow Competition was held in January 2023 at Dunwoody College in Minneapolis. The purpose of the competition is to challenge university and college students to design, build, and operate a fully autonomous snowplow utilizing the state-of-the-art in navigation and control technologies to remove snow from a designated path. Today's webinar is presented by Shane Riddle and Ian Adams, two members of the first place team. Ian Adams is a PhD candidate and grad research assistant at Case Western Reserve University and is a robotics and software engineer for the Stanley Black & Decker Outdoors Extreme Innovations Group. He's been involved with the Autonomous Snowplow Competition since 2016. Shane Riddle is a mechanical engineering PhD student and graduate research assistant in the Center for Biologically Inspired Robotics Research at Case Western Reserve University, where his main work focuses on developing soft worm-like robots and synthetic nervous system controllers. Following their presentation, we'll take questions from the audience. You can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button in your viewer. So thanks for joining us. We'll now turn the time over to Ian and Shane.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. As introduced, we're Team OTTO from Case Western Reserve. So Shane and I are two members of a six-man team who are all, in some connection being advised by Roger Quinn in the Biologically Inspired Robotics Group. Most of us are mechanical engineers, although Will Norse, who works in close conjunction with us, is an electrical engineer. And although these individuals couldn't be here today, we value their contribution quite highly and want to make sure that they're recognized here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this autonomous snowplow competition, we wanted to kind of take a second to discuss kind of what it's about. I know it was introduced a little bit earlier, but the competition has a long history, stretching back to about 2012, when I believe it transitioned from an autonomous lawnmower competition and moved north to become an autonomous snowplow competition. Pictured here in the upper right is the team photograph from the 2012 iteration. And I want to mention that even back then, this little short-bladed plow was, in essence, similar, or basically the same robot that we're working with today, albeit a number of sensors behind. These days, the other two photos on the screen are photos from this last year. We've had the pleasure of having international teams from Canada and a number of teams. We've had schools that have sent multiple teams to contribute to the event. The event, as stated, was held at Dunwoody College of Technology. And they really do a phenomenal job of hosting everybody and kind of having space for us to work on robots and to plow snow and to keep warm because you can't plow snow in the middle of summer. So as stated, the objectives for these are kind of to use a fully autonomous snowplow to clear snow from a predetermined arena and return to its initial point of departure. This is sort of to simulate a hypothetical product or a use case where someone had some form of an autonomous snowplow and it had to return to its point of origin. Teams will institute any number of sensors or fiducials or other kind of markers to assist that thing in operating to plow path of snow. Ultimately, that is kind of the point of the competition. There's a great emphasis placed on the ability to plow snow, and that every team who shows up does at least get to do that. We kind of want to make sure that people get to see their engineering work pay off. To give a kind of brief introduction to what this year's competition field looked like, it was the so-called T field, where robots would start in the vehicle garage or starting zone over here. The teams would be allowed to place markers, navigation aids, etc., both in and around the blue marked off field. In practice, the robot had to be able to navigate in this space and maintain presence in here without going out or risking a large penalty. The snow spaces are these white squares laid out in a 10 meter by 1 meter strip. Each of these is a 1 meter by 1 meter square. and then placed somewhere in the fields in the plowed snow zone and in somewhere along the path. One of those positions is replaced by an obstacle. Students have limited knowledge beforehand about where those are, and so they either have to react quickly and navigate around it using their guidance system, or ideally to dynamically avoid the obstacle in operation. There's a giant convoluted kind of scoring system here, but the takeaway is that the more snow you clear from each zone, and the fewer things you hit, and the fewer number of times you have to try to plow the snow, the better your score is. Ultimately, at the end, speed is a minor tiebreaker, but the point of it is to try and carefully and as completely as possible remove snow from the starting locations.
All right, here is a couple images of the robot itself. You'll notice on the left that he is not in a snowy environment. OTTO is actually in a field. So OTTO is a multi-purpose research platform, actually. So Ian on the off months, so actually in most of the year, so like spring, summer, fall, when there's no snow, is using the robot for his own research, which involves doing it's called Greener Pastures is the grant. But it's basically doing autonomous navigation around livestock so that it is able to perform or doing the groundwork to later be able to perform some kind of field sanitization work. But essentially that is, so OTTO is used for many purposes, which is why you'll see him not in, and later on, basically this is just to introduce you that later on we have some horses that you'll see in the LIDAR images and to explain why those are there, instead of it being snow and obstacles that you would see in the wintertime. On the right, you'll see the actual robot, a little bit more plow-like structure. His wheelbase is he's basically a 32 by 32 box with the wheels on. His motors are taken from an electric wheelchair, an Invacare DC electric wheelchair actually. And he is driven via skid steering. So there's only two motors, one on each side, and the chains that you see there connect the two wheels. So he is a little bit of a he slips around corners sometimes, but it actually works very well to like turn on the spot, which is very useful for the plowing purposes. There used to be a linear actuator on that plow to give it some articulation. We will explain why that is no longer there in later sessions, but just basically it broke off, and we did not have time to fix it, but it is something that we plan to add again in the future. You'll see that obviously when you're plowing snow, you also need to have the weight behind it. So if you try to plow 20 pounds of snow with a 10-pound robot, it's not going to go anywhere. So underneath, you'll see there's a little bit of a panel that we use to load them up with weights as needed for the amount of snow that we're pushing. Inside that Pelican case on top of him, there are all of our processing components. So the Pelican case insulates it from both the moisture in the outside atmosphere as well as the cold, harsh winter of Minnesota. All the top mounted components that you may have seen on the previous one are sealed and weatherproofed, as are the LIDAR and the motors. Importantly, the temperature control is also rated to go down to about -40, which is good because it hit -20 quite a few times in Minnesota while we were there. And I say we focus on the temperature. The temperature is a high focus because again, it gets very cold, and also we've had components in the past fail. So this has been, a lot of our components have been moved into this as much as possible. And we've had to replace some outside components with ones that do work in much colder temperatures. But on the bright side, when things are in this case, they tend to kind of generate their own heat, because this is also where the computer gets housed and a couple other things. So it does get nice and toasty in there and prevents the freezing of any components that aren't rated down to that temperature. As far as our as far as our heat generator goes and our computing skills go, we use an Intel NUC Skull Canyon. The NUC has a i7 processor in it, and on it we run Linux in the flavor of Ubuntu 18.04. And our flavor of ROS that we use is melodic. So our ROS is basically just allows us to use a lot of plug and play packages to get our robot up and running in as fast as possible in as simple a manner as possible. As far as navigating goes, so we use an unscented common filter to kind of tie together absolute and relative sensors. The unscented common filter that we use is actually an open source package. It's called ROS Robot Localization. It's essentially an off-the-shelf common filter, which is really good if you've ever worked with a common filter and know how frustrating they could be. But we were able to feed our sensor data for both of them in and get the best of both worlds. So our absolute sensors are GPS. They're really good at precision, but they're a bit slower and they accumulate errors, or they don't accumulate errors. The relative sensors do accumulate more hours and are faster. So if we use the unscented common filter, we can get the best of both worlds and get high precision and high speed. Speaking of our LIDAR data, we have here our LIDAR system. We have implemented an Ouster OS132 LIDAR. Its range is 120 meters, which is pretty good. Most of the features that we see in the parking lot that we do the competition in are less than that away. The entire competition field is only like 30 meters wide, so it should, or maybe even 20 meters wide, not that big. So it definitely sees everything in its vicinity, and it can even see stuff outside to help it get a lock on where it is and do the localization. It has a 45-degree field of view, so it is a 3D LiDAR. It is able to see 22.5 degrees below and above its plane. You'll notice previously it was on a bit of a stalk, so that was to get it above the plow head, because the plow head, if it sees the plow head, it'll see it as an obstacle and it'll try to avoid the plow head and never move. So we also get rid of some of the stuff behind it because it can also see itself behind. There's some filtering that goes on later, but we'll talk about that in a second. As said before, this is very weatherproof, even shock resistant, which is excellent in case it gets dropped, which it won't because it's very secure, because we like this thing and we don't want it to break. And you get a lot of this functionality for a pretty mid-range price at $3,000 to $4,000. It's currently used to do obstacle detection and avoidance. We also use it to do a pretty decent slam, again, using a ROS package. We like to mention ROS quite a few times because it really does have a lot of good things that you can just kind of pull out of a repository and instantly slap into your robot. And in a very short amount of time relative to not having that, you can definitely get a robot up and running, or at least a sensor system up and running. And so this one is using particularly HDL graph slam. And you can see what that looks like on the following page. So on the right, you'll see, this is why we mentioned the horses earlier. So you can see Otto interacting with the horse. The horse has its head bent down. You can kind of see that Otto is seeing the ground as well. All of these concentric rings are essentially the 22.5 field degree of view, is showing you a planar surface in some circles. Obviously there's some, this is in a field, so it's not a perfect circle like you'd see on the left, but you can basically see the ground structure right here. It's almost like a topographic map. You'll notice on the left, this is a bit more precise. This is the more idealized simulation in, what is this? It's in Gazebo. You can see on the bottom, this is our mock-up of the course. It used to be not a T-shape, it used to be just a single eye, or an out and back essentially kind of field. So this is a bit of an old picture, but it still shows the concept quite well. You can see that the concentric rings are on the ground, showing you the plane of the surface it can roll on. You can also very clearly see the barriers that make up the outside of the surface. You can even see a bit of a person on the outside in a car. But very importantly, you can see this post in the middle, which is exactly, it's very representative of what the kind of obstacles you see in the playing field are. So these large tube-like structures are very similar to the posts that we run into, or try not to run into, I should say, in the field. And I didn't mention before, but on the previous slide, I showed that there was, we said that there was potential to be using this LiDAR system as snow coverage detection. You can see that this strip, this rectangular strip that's been laid down in the simulation, you can kind of see that it even shows up in the LiDAR data over here as a bit of a ripple in this. It might be hard to see, but anyway, there's a bit of a ripple right where you would expect this snow coverage to be. We had planned to figure out a way to use that for snow detection to see how much has been plowed and how much is left to be plowed. We never got around to it, but it is still something that we could probably implement. And lastly, on the right side, you'll see that there's a large gap in our concentric rings. So the LiDAR is capable of doing 360-degree field of view. But that said, there's a little bit of a blip in the very center of those rings. You can see this little greenish dot and then a little bit of red around it. That is, again, the robot seeing himself. In the LiDAR data, it shows up, but in the control algorithm, we crop that out so that we can, again, try to have Otto not trying to avoid himself while he is operating.
So the other half of our navigation setup, we are using a U-Blox Z F9P GPS, RTK GPS. We have it on a CO99 application board. Although that is sort of a preference sort of thing. The ZF9P is compatible with GPS, BIDO, GLONASS, and Galileo. So you get access to all constellations, pretty much all of them that you're going to care about. It's got a relatively good power draw, which makes it appealing for lightweight or low power consumption applications. The actual board that we have has one of the selling features is it also has an Odin W2 Wi-Fi and Bluetooth module, which really helps set up multiple connections. So if you want to orchestrate, a base station and a rover or something like that, it's a great off-the-shelf way to do that. The carrier board is actually compatible with an Arduino Mega, I think. So you could theoretically have one of these attached and be off to the races. But that's kind of just potential features. The ZF9P holds some very good performance for monetary value. The carrier board that we're working, the full carrier board system we're working with is about a $300 per solution. I think the individual chipset stuff gets a little bit cheaper than that. But there's a wide variety of boards that use the ZF9P module quite successfully. We've compared this to other GPSs like our Novatel and the Swift Duro, and have found that the price point to performance for this has been pretty appealing. The thing reports to have a 3 to 6 centimeter position fix. In practice, we've actually gotten it down to around 2 centimeters while surveying in or while in a static position. Obviously, this degrades if you move fast or move quick, in and around the arena. Even if you don't have an RTK correction service, you can get usually quite good single receiver positioning in the order of magnitude 10 centimeters. They list that as their thing, and I found that to be quite similar to what we've gotten, although not quite exactly. It sort of varies depending upon sky view and some other obstacles. We include these as an example. We have an image here showing a green path outlined from GPS coordinates and the cyan line from wheel encoder odometry. And this is just to demonstrate why we care a great deal about including this for these applications. Because those relative sensors can very quickly diverge. And even though the robot did complete a full circuit, if you asked the cyan paperclip, it wouldn't agree. We leverage some strength both in Ohio for testing and in Minnesota via their respective state Department of Transportations for having a continually operating reference stations for corrections. And so our robot listens to those while operating there to achieve RTK fix. Not all the states that we work in have that. Here in Virginia, at Virginia Tech, where I'm doing research, there is not a statewide version of this. And so it's important to us to be able to have a method to set up a surveyed in base station to provide RTK corrections. Moving on to talk a little bit about our guidance system design. We're using the ROS nav stack, which is a very mature code base and has a number of options to provide all sorts of navigation or guidance methods. In principle, the way it works is that LIDAR data, here shown in these little red balls, constructs a filled-in occupancy grid of obstacles, which are shown in magenta. Those are then inflated in cyan to provide a cost map of where to go. And then there are a number of search algorithms you can use to navigate from a point to a desired goal by basically solving for minimum cost on that cost map. Our current robot is using a DWA planner, which stands for a dynamic window approach. Basically, what happens is the robot hypothetically makes a series of trajectories, and then picks the one of those that has the least cost on the cost map in order to arrive, and then it follows on that path. Goals are issued as a service, and in the competition, we have a high-level program that issues a waypoint whenever the robot gets to the most recent waypoint. So it will issue go to coordinate 1. When it achieves coordinate 1, the high-level program will issue go to coordinate 2, and it uses dynamic window approach to avoid obstacles throughout. I believe the next slide is going to actually show off. One ahead. So here's an example of some of the filtering that we can do with LIDAR to turn it from a kind of messy, rather unreadable form to extract useful information out of it. So the raw LIDAR you can see here is a top-down view. You can see the thing kind of seeing itself here and causing a shadow. But you can also see that there are a number of silhouettes. These are cattle that are nearby. We take that data, and by doing a couple of pass-through filters, we crop out ground plane, we crop out, this one doesn't show it, but we on our current operation, we remove the self-occlusion, and then we can further go and segment the clouds and construct positions for where they are and how big they are. But in practice, most of the time, we're just feeding these filtered positions, sometimes downsampled, to our raw nav stack to generate a cost map. But we can do further object tracking and stuff like that using these LIDAR and this LIDAR and the same kind of filtering process. So this is a video of the robot operating.
So this is the robot navigating around some horses. He does nothing for a little bit. He's just waiting for the horses to go away a little bit so he can move around them. You can
I don't know how the frame rate's going. This is an example of it in operation in the current the current research project. So the cost map, when it's inflated to a certain degree, will prevent the robot from moving, and then once it clears, the robot can then continue trying to do avoidance. I don't know how well the frame rate's working for the viewers, but in any case, if you'd like, you can go to the next one.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, okay, so why are you doing this? It does not like that video. All right. Okay, so you can see on here, this is back to the competition away from the horses. We have our path planning along the T-shaped field. So this is our initial idea. We would start at the black dot and we would try to get our way to the white dot, and try to hit through as many of those white squares as possible along the way. So this particular plan involved us with the actuated plow. Again, we had to take that off, so there are some alterations to this, but the initial idea before we knew where any of the obstacles were was to plow straight forward with the plow facing head on, so we could push as much snow into that plowed zone as possible. And then we would do a bit of a turn and get all the way back to clear the bottom half of the snow. Again, that plow would be then tilted away to the left so that we could get a lot of the plowed snow here over to this side of the plowed snow zone. At the end, because it's skid steering, this is a big advantage of that. We can kind of pivot in place almost with a very small diameter or a very small radius of turning. It's like a couple of inches compared to trying to do an actual turn. And then we come back along the rest of the field, plowing as far as we can along the purple arrow, and then do another U-turn or do another pivot down the green line and then back to the garage. So this was the initial plan, and a lot of it depended on, or at least the very first movement depended on having an actuated head. We had to make alterations that looked something like this once we had seen the field. So prior to getting to the competition field, we had no idea where the posts would be placed. We knew that there would be one away from the white, or the one that was not in the path of the snow and one that would be in the path of the snow. So when we got there, we coded up some new waypoints. You'll see that there are quite a few more waypoints. This was because our initial plan was a bit too vague. So we gave the robot a bit too much freedom to determine its own path around the obstacle that was in the path of the snow. Basically, when we had come all the way out, basically where this green dot is, which represents the post over here by this participant, it would get there and then it would not know which side of the yellow post to go around. The yellow post is kind of hidden behind all the volunteer here, but you can kind of see just a pitch of it right there. So basically, we weren't very sure if this was going to go around the left of this post or the right of this post. So we just, in order to get as much snowplow as possible, we decided to hard code a couple more waypoints in. But essentially, we just go a little bit shorter up, do a little bit of a more conservative pass around this yellow post, do our little pivot as planned, and then add another waypoint or two around the post that was in the path. And then the rest of the plan seemed to go pretty much according to the initial plan. We didn't have to change too much. The only downfall of this one is we missed a little bit of snow right in this gap between the purple, green, and red arrows right here. But it was better than hitting the obstacles, which is a far higher penalization than missing a little bit of snow. As for the competition experience, winning is nice, but the path there isn't always the clearest or the easiest. Every year we have something go wrong, and every year it's a crapshoot whether or not it's something major or something minor. Typically there's one easily fixable problem and one relatively difficult problem in our experience. In years past, we've had stuff like the weld that holds the tire connector piece to the axle pops off, which is something that we can't fix until we get back to Dunwoody the next day, because it always happens at midnight, and it's always the best time that we're just kind of stressing while we sleep. This year, a similar thing happened, but it was easier for us to fix, and the time just took a little bit longer. We had like a tire kind of just pull away from its rim because it got really cold in the Minnesota winter, and the tire deflated enough that it just kind of unseated itself. So reseating that, putting it all back together, that was a couple hours of effort at midnight again. But at least that one was fixable. We've also had a couple, this year's biggest, that was our minor issue this year. Our big issue this year was an electrical problem that I'll let Ian tell you a little bit about.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this robot has existed in some form or the other, pretty much unchanged, at least from the core of it, going back to about 2012 or so. And this was fine for many years. We experienced or started to experience a repeated circuit break failure, where the circuit would trip despite having, well under what we expected to have for our nominal load on it. On inspection, we had sent the photo of our failing circuit breaker to our electrical engineer friend Will, who was not on site because he couldn't make it. And his response was, you should call me, because that is an AC circuit breaker in a DC powered circuit. Apologies, it was as traumatic for us to find that out as it was for everybody, as for anybody else in the engineering space around. We got that rectified, but it was an adventure in trying to find out who sold 50 amp DC circuit breakers at 11 at night. And those kind of failures or faults are somewhat common when you think that everything works fine because you're not looking at it. And that was a bit of a wake-up call to, oh yeah, just because something is working doesn't mean it will always work or was built right in the first place. Moving from the electrical failure, which was our big one, to software failures, which are a lot more prolific and a lot more tedious to solve. But I like to say that code grows rust, that just because something ran fine 6 months ago doesn't mean it will continue to run fine when you need it now. And our ability to work on it kind of rusts because, even despite our best efforts, sometimes things get, don't go commented that should go commented. And there's always some sort of an error that someone in the past knew how to fix, but doesn't know how to do it now. And those problems always inevitably rear their head at the last minute when you need everything to work right now. That's a pretty common experience at this kind of an event. There's a mention here of a death spiral, which is something we encountered a lot while in operation. Shane can show you the following video here.
The problem with the death spiral, can I? Let's find out. Yeah, the problem with the death spiral is that it is actually a feature, not necessarily a bug, but it turns into an issue when it doesn't stop. So the death spiral is actually supposed to just be, you'll see in a second, it's going to kind of lose where it is or get kind of confused by the large amount of stuff around it because it is in a hallway, it's pretty narrow. So it's going to do a spiral, a circle essentially to relocalize itself in this lamp. So it's kind of a reset button. The problem is when it doesn't stop resetting and it just gets caught in, as you can see, it's just going to keep going. This kind of spiral that never ends. So it'll just spin in place for like minutes on end, and eventually it's possible that it could relocalize itself, but it's kind of not a guarantee, you know. So we ran into the death spiral, which wasn't featured on a bug kind of issue. We fixed it, I believe, by changing the cost map a bit so that it wouldn't detect quite so much interference with its path. But that was, figuring that out was in itself a bit of a process. There we go. I believe that is the last of what we have slide-wise.
Yeah, so just want to, you know, kind of say that we have a lot of fun every year that we go out there and do this. I've been a longtime participant, and you know, basically besides me, everybody else in this photo is, you know, first or second year, and it doesn't seem like a lot of fun at the first time when you go do it, but you know, everybody being together, crunch working on a problem and just being dead focused on it, being dead tired, it's cold. Eventually, you know, they're all kind of miserable at the beginning, but after the competition is over, win, lose, or draw, invariably someone will say, so we're doing this next year, right? And so I just want to say the folks who run this competition do a phenomenal job of making this an engaging and exciting thing to kind of always return to. It's been a lot of fun for us, and we enjoy, you know, kind of learning together, working on it.
It's a very fun competition. When Ian's sales pitch to me when I first joined was, hey, you want to go up and freeze your butt off in the Minnesota weather for 5 days and just stay up and drink energy drinks for 5 days straight, which wasn't a great sales pitch, but I was beholden to do it because he had taught me Ross for a class that we were in. So it was my penance, but I did end up liking it once I was forced to go. It was very much the sales pitch was very much underhyping the project. It was a very cool competition to be a part of. Definitely worth the -20 degrees, no matter how cold intolerant you are, but very, very fun.
I think with that, we'd like to open it up to Q&A.
Great. Yeah. If viewers, if you have questions, you can click the Q&A button in your viewer and type your question in. Great presentation. Ian and Shane, appreciate your time and sharing this. It looks like it's been an interesting, challenging, and fun creative process for you. So just a couple of questions that came to mind while I watched your presentation. One being, you've talked about like your LIDAR and the sensors you used. What are some things that you've ended up, maybe you've considered, maybe you've used them in the past, but you've decided not to use them or moved away from them?
So I know the one that I can think of that comes to mind is we used to have an image, some kind of essentially a camera on the robot. It was a T265. That particular item froze frequently. We used it partly for the imaging, partly for the IMU inside of it. So there was a bit of some kind of gyro IMU kind of deal. Essentially, it was not rated down for the cold weather of Minnesota, so it froze constantly, and it was an issue. We initially had decided to keep it on and just build like a heated chamber for it, but that just proved to be more of a pain than it was worth. And we got a much better LIDAR to. It didn't really replace that particular piece in general, but getting a better LIDAR than we had initially solved the issue in a different way.
Yeah, I'll add on the T265. It's an Intel RealSense T265. I think they have since discontinued the line or merged it in with another one of their RealSense products, which are great products. They work very well, but the T265 had great performance indoors, which is where we did a good number of our tests, and then would immediately fault when going outside in the gray kind of, saturated space. And so us kind of relying on a sensor like that meant that it was inevitable to fail. And when it did, it kind of took the whole run down with it. We have in the past used a couple of other different types of GPS. We have an old holdover Novotel from when Case participated in the DARPA Urban Challenge. That proved to be finicky and a little troublesome to run, but we were not really particularly keen on using it. We've also had we used SICK LMS 111 LIDAR, which is still a perfectly functional LIDAR. It's a 270-degree field of view, single plane LIDAR. We've opted not to use it mostly because we moved towards 3D for other applications for research purposes. And then it just kind of became an older, not as good tool. It's still on the robot, still could be run, but it's not one that we're relying on for our current operation.
Oh, great. Thanks. Nope. Very, very interesting. And how have you, I guess this, from what I understand, is this platform you've kind of developed through the years. Where do you source your parts and your components from?
So it's sort of a kind of ad hoc kind of thing. We end up, the project has had a couple of senior projects that have built up portions of it that became foundational. One senior project built the chassis. There's another couple senior projects which have worked on doing stuff for the differential, the RTK base stations and things like that, or at least kind of working with the U blocks. And so we've had some success with those. We've also, by virtue of being so closely attached to or closely working with MTD or Stanley Black & Decker, formerly MTD, we've had a lot of donated gear from them, where they've provided a battery and a few other goods for us. There's kind of an additional thing where when we get some money from participating in this event, we kind of end up paying it forward for the next trip, but sometimes replacement parts or additional machining and tooling that goes onto the platform. And so it's participation in this that kind of keeps itself going.
Yeah, great. Now, I guess one final question we have is, if you were giving a piece of advice to a team starting this competition for the first time, you're going to give them some friendly pointers or advice, what might that be?
I'll offer a couple, then I guess Shane can maybe offer a couple. My first piece of advice is I would play around in the ROS space, and I would look at what other, what other groups are doing in ROS. ROS is largely has a community of open source packages and development stuff, and there's a lot of easy wins in terms of constructing things. There's somebody who wrote the GPS driver, and so if someone wants to rewrite a GPS driver to run a particular GPS, that's fine. It's a perfectly good project. But I think that if your goal is to get a robot up and running, it might be a better task to try and find what's out there so you can get something operational. Then you get to the fun part about what you make the robot do. I think I would also say that my number one piece of advice for the actual participation in the competition is to give yourself a little bit of time to get there and do stuff. We're infamous maybe for showing up about 3 or 4 days before the competition actually starts. We rent an Airbnb and we all cram in there. We throw all of the code up on a big TV screen, and we all work collaboratively together on things. It didn't always used to be this way, but these days we all pretty much, everybody's in on everything. Everybody spends time in the coding hot seat, and we all are kind of collaboratively working together so that everybody kind of knows the robot inside and out. There's never someone's like, I just know how to, fix the mechanical problems on it, or I just know how to fix the electrical problems on it. It's everybody kind of does collaborative work on all of it, and we give ourselves some time to get set up and get things going. I think teams might find themselves a little bit more difficult if they have to get the robot working someplace else, then pick up and pretend or hope that it works immediately when they get it off the thing. And I think that that's like a big challenge. Like, it's a huge challenge. Moving robots and moving bases of operation, things that work well in the lab might not work well in person when you move it off site and turn a camera onto it. And so I think that those problems can be a little bit better solved by, making sure that you give yourself time to deploy it.
Okay, great.
Shane, do you
Shane,
have any,
anything to add to that?
So I agree with Ian on the time thing. Ideally, I mean, I'll freely admit, we do probably 80% of the work on a robot every year, the week we're there. Granted, that is also because the robot does get some tune-ups and some field work in throughout the rest of the year while Ian's working on it with his research project. But are converting it back into a snowplow and then doing the alterations we need to do to get it to work and running like that typically happen the week we're there. So I would say, even though we get there a couple days early, even that is sometimes not enough. We were very close this year to not making it. We were literally coding our waypoints as we walked to our second and final run of the competition, which is not something that we would like to have happen again. We would like to be able to have that done the night before, kind of deal.
Yeah, please don't do that. That's a piece of advice not to do. Don't do what we do. Don't do that.
No, definitely plan a bit more ahead. We definitely, testing the week of is very important, but testing and doing all of your testing like 3 or 4 days in advance is not ideal. You should probably do it like 2 weeks before, and then for the rest of the week before, and then give yourself the 3 days there, because then worst case scenario, you're just sitting in Minnesota having a fun time. Best case scenario, or worst case scenario, you are going and trying to do all the stuff, but you have at least time to do them if something pops up. Like I said, our circuit breaker problem and our wheel popping off did not present themselves until we got there. Like, the robot was working perfectly fine Monday or Tuesday before we left, and the 2 days after we got there, which is like a night and a half before our competition, is when the problem started to emerge. So testing in the environment is very important.
Yeah, great. We did have a question here from Sunil, one of the organizers of the competition, who asked, do you find it more challenging from a navigation standpoint dealing with things like moving horses and cows, or the environmental challenges, for example, maybe flying snow?
So the flying snow, I know we have a leaf filter. I'm pretty sure we have a leaf filter on it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ian.
No, we do a down sample to deal with things like, like a single occupied voxel, or spurious LIDAR reading. I would think that the biggest problem for the approaches that we have in spaces that are not well, or that are a little bit less structured, in pastures, there's a lot of rolling hills. And kind of appearing and disappearing features and landmarks. And I think that if you're relying on SLAM, like our current platform does a little bit, or a lot, that those features are difficult to keep track of. Whereas regular building blocks and cars and things like those have a lot of detail that it's easy to map as the thing moves around. I think that moving obstacles in the form of horses, because the way that we use that, or the way that we navigate around them, they're not as challenging as getting the localization right. There's a trade-off that the consequences for being, off by 2 centimeters is not as bad in the middle of a pasture as it is on a sidewalk. But I think that retaining that localization is the hard part when you're dealing with things like, a bunch of horses moving around you, than little bits of snow falling. And being on a building, being in a space where there's a big building that you can see all the sides and features of, because they're well away and no one's gonna, crowd the robot that closely, means that it's a little easier to rely on it.
Okay, great, thanks. One final question here. You've alluded to this with the fact that your robot platform is used and reconfigured for different things, but I know the two of you have different research interests and focuses. So what other applications do you see your technology working with? that you've developed here?
So the stuff on this robot is very much oriented towards navigation. So anything that it doesn't have to be plowing snow or doing a pasture thing, but anything involving some kind of navigation, this is pretty applicable to. As so long as you have access to the sensing that you need. So again, if you're in a desolate area with no GPS, you can't use GPS. But that also alludes to the fact that we have a lot of ROS packages. So the biggest takeaway for me personally has been that ROS is a very powerful tool. I'm aware that it takes many, many years to build a robot if you don't have some kind of standardized repository of the drivers, how to interact with them, stuff like that. And ROS really does that. So figuring out a way to streamline the robot design process is applicable in pretty much any robotic application. But basically, especially something like the unscented common filter, which are notoriously difficult to do from scratch. Since there is something that you can pretty much just take off the shelf, plug all of your sensors into it, as long as you have the sensing you need. It's knowing that you have tools that can combine the various sensor readings, no matter what they are, where they come from, into a meaningful and very useful way to much more precisely and better navigate around something, or even do some other task, is a very powerful tool. So it's not like we're doing groundbreaking research with that on that front. ROS, again, the packages we already took from someone else, it's an open source kind of thing. We can get them online. But building the skills and knowing that they can be used in such a way is really helpful for us as researchers and as roboticists.
I want to throw in there that I kind of see directly from stuff we work on here. I'll mention a little anecdote. When we were staying at our most recent Airbnb, Clayton took our robot and used it to plow the neighbor's driveway. We're ostensibly doing it to clear some space and set some stuff up and just kind of make the robot do some work. And every time someone has ever taken a look at any of the robots, not just ours, everybody else who participates in the snowplow competition, they're always like, when can I buy one? Okay. And I would like to believe that the work we kind of work on and the methods that we work on and perfect here could eventually, or ideally soon, be useful for something like that. Because ever since we've had one of these, it's been like a thing to be like, I would love to be able to stand behind my front door and look out the window and have a robot or have something that means I don't have to go out there and shovel in my pajamas. And I think
we can definitely do it with remote control right now. But just if you wanted to sip your coffee while you're waiting and just watching it do something for you. The
nature of those kind of things is that I think we're working closer and closer and closer to them. We're almost there, where people could possibly have something like this, or these could be a little bit more common in the world. And I think that fewer people going out to go plow their driveway in their pajamas will mean fewer people slipping and falling and getting injured and other things like that, or other sorts of small scale delivery and autonomous navigation in our world is a widely applicable goal to all sorts of products. And I hope to believe, or I do believe that we're getting close to them being available for the everyman.
Hey, well, that's great insights, and it's been a great presentation. We've enjoyed your presentation today. Thank you for joining us for our audience, and thanks to Ian and Shane for your time in preparation. We remind everyone that a recording of today's webinar will be posted to our website and social media channels, usually within a day or two. Thanks again. We hope you'll join us soon for a future Iowan webinar. Have a great day, everyone.